Before we begin, if you're fascinated by the hidden stories of Cold War espionage and the real human cost behind intelligence operations, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. We uncover these forgotten cases every week, bringing you the documented truth behind some of history's most consequential secrets. On the afternoon of October 9th, 1992, at approximately 2:45 p.m., a CIA security officer named Paul Redmond sat in a windowless office on the 6th floor of the CIA's headquarters building in Langley, Virginia, reviewing annual financial disclosure forms submitted by agency employees who held security clearances. The forms, required by federal regulation, asked employees to list their assets, income sources, foreign travel, and any financial relationships that might present conflicts of interest or security vulnerabilities. Redmond, 51 years old, had been working in the CIA's Office of Security for 18 years. His specific assignment that autumn afternoon was unremarkable: a routine compliance check of several hundred disclosure forms looking for inconsistencies, omissions, or red flags that might warrant further review. The form that caught Redmond's attention belonged to Aldrich Ames, a 51-year-old operations officer in the CIA's Counterintelligence Center. Ames had been with the agency since 1962, 30 years of service, most of it spent in operations related to Soviet intelligence. According to his personnel file, his annual salary was $69,843. His financial disclosure form, however, listed assets that seemed inconsistent with that salary level. The form indicated that Ames and his wife, Rosario, owned a house in Arlington, Virginia, valued at $540,000. They owned two relatively new vehicles, a Jaguar sedan purchased in 1989 and a Honda Accord purchased in 1991. The form listed various credit card accounts, some with significant balances, and checking and savings accounts at several banks. What the form did not clearly explain was how a mid-level CIA officer earning less than $70,000 per year could afford a house worth more than $500,000 and luxury automobiles. Redmond made a note on the form and placed it in a separate stack for forms requiring additional scrutiny. At that moment, he did not suspect espionage. Financial irregularities could have numerous explanations: inheritances, family money, outside investments, errors in reporting. But they required verification. That was the procedure, and Redmond followed it. The note he made would trigger a process that would, over the next 16 months, expose one of the most damaging intelligence penetrations in American history and reveal that Aldrich Ames had been a Soviet intelligence asset for nearly 8 years, during which time he had compromised virtually every significant CIA operation targeting the Soviet Union and had caused the deaths of at least 10 human sources who had been providing intelligence to the United States. But on that October afternoon in 1992, Redmond simply made a note and moved on to the next form in the stack. Aldrich Ames had been born on May 26, 1941, in River Falls, Wisconsin. His father, Carlton Ames, was a college professor who joined the CIA in the early 1950s and served in various overseas postings, primarily in Southeast Asia. His mother, Rachel, struggled with alcoholism throughout Aldrich's childhood, a struggle that created instability in the family and would later influence Aldrich's own complicated relationship with alcohol. Growing up in a CIA family meant frequent relocations. Aldrich spent portions of his childhood in Burma, where his father was stationed under State Department cover. He attended the University of Chicago, where he studied history, but did not complete his degree. In 1962, at the age of 21, he joined the CIA as a records analyst, following in his father's professional footsteps. His career was undistinguished. He worked in various analytical and administrative positions before being assigned to overseas postings in Ankara, Turkey, and later New York City, where he worked undercover targeting Soviet officials at the United Nations. Performance reviews described him as competent but noted concerns about his attention to detail and his tendency to drink excessively at social functions. In 1972, Ames married Nancy Segabarth, a fellow CIA employee. The marriage would last 13 years and was troubled from the beginning. In 1981, Ames was assigned to Mexico City as chief of the Soviet counterintelligence branch, a significant promotion despite his mixed record. There, in 1982, he met Maria del Rosario Casas Dupuy, a cultural attaché at the Colombian embassy. Rosario was 29 years old, 12 years younger than Ames, intelligent, attractive, and ambitious. Ames began an affair with her while still married to Nancy. Ames and Nancy separated in 1983. He returned to CIA headquarters in Langley, and his divorce was finalized in 1984. The divorce had been financially costly. Under the settlement, he was required to pay alimony and divide their modest assets. His financial situation became precarious. Rosario, meanwhile, had expensive tastes and expectations that Ames could not easily meet on a CIA salary of approximately $60,000. In the spring of 1985, Aldrich Ames was 44 years old, divorced, in debt, planning to remarry a woman who expected a lifestyle he could not afford. And feeling professionally undervalued after more than 20 years of service. He was assigned to the Counterintelligence Center at Langley, where his responsibilities included managing CIA operations targeting Soviet intelligence officers. This position gave him access to the identities of Soviet officials who were cooperating with the CIA, individuals who, in many cases, were risking their lives to provide information to the United States. On April 16, 1985, Aldrich Ames walked into the Soviet embassy on 16th Street Northwest in Washington, D.C. He requested to speak with a KGB officer. When he was brought to a meeting room, he handed over an envelope containing the names of several Soviet officials who were working as CIA sources. In exchange, he requested money. The KGB officer, recognizing the extraordinary value of what Ames was offering, agreed immediately. Ames was given $50,000 in cash. The decision Ames made on April 16, 1985, would have catastrophic consequences. Within months, virtually every significant CIA source inside the Soviet Union began disappearing. Some were arrested, interrogated, and executed. Others simply vanished. By the end of 1986, the CIA's ability to collect human intelligence on the Soviet Union had been almost entirely destroyed. Aldrich Ames married Rosario on August 10, 1985, 4 months after he had walked into the Soviet embassy. Within months, his lifestyle began to change in ways that should have attracted attention, but initially did not. In November 1985, Ames and Rosario traveled to Europe, Switzerland, Italy, France, on a trip that cost approximately $18,000, far more than Ames could afford on his CIA salary. When asked about the trip by colleagues, he explained that Rosario's family had money and had paid for much of it. In 1986, Ames paid cash for home improvements costing approximately $30,000. Again, he attributed it to Rosario's family money. In 1989, Ames and Rosario purchased a new house in Arlington, Virginia, in an upscale neighborhood called Shirlington. The house was a large, modern residence with a two-car garage and views of the surrounding area. The purchase price was $540,000. Ames paid for it in cash. Paying cash for a $500,000 house should have been a glaring red flag. When questioned by security officers, Ames said that Rosario's family had given them approximately $300,000 as a gift. He provided documents that appeared to support this claim, including what purported to be a transfer of funds from a Colombian bank account. The explanation was reviewed and accepted. At this point in 1989, while the CIA knew it had suffered severe compromises of its Soviet operations, the internal investigation had not yet focused on Ames as a suspect. In 1991, Ames purchased a red Jaguar XJ6 sedan for approximately $50,000. He paid cash. That same year, he spent more than $18,000 on credit cards for personal expenses, travel, restaurants, clothing, jewelry. By 1992, Ames's total unexplained assets exceeded $1.4 million. His annual CIA salary was approximately $70,000. The turning point came in the spring of 1991, when the CIA and FBI initiated a formal joint investigation into the compromises of CIA operations targeting the Soviet Union. The investigation, code-named Night Mover, was led by a team of CIA counterintelligence officers and FBI special agents. The team began by compiling a list of CIA employees who had access to the compromised operations. The list was long. Dozens of officers had access to some or all of the relevant information. By late 1991, the investigation had narrowed the list of suspects to fewer than 40 individuals. Aldrich Ames was on the list, but he was not initially a high-priority suspect. Then, in early 1992, the investigation team decided to conduct detailed financial analyses of the remaining suspects. This would involve obtaining complete banking records, credit card statements, and detailed transaction histories. The analysis of Ames's finances was assigned to Special Agent Leslie Weiser of the FBI's Washington field office. Weiser, 38 years old, was an experienced financial crimes investigator with a background in forensic accounting. She began obtaining Ames's complete banking records from every financial institution where he held accounts. The process required subpoenas and took several months. By October 1992, when Paul Redmond was reviewing Ames's financial disclosure form, Weiser had assembled a detailed picture of Ames's financial transactions dating back to 1985. What she found was extraordinary. Between 1985 and 1992, Ames had deposited more than $1.3 million in cash and wire transfers into his various bank accounts. The deposits followed no consistent pattern in terms of timing or amount, but they were far in excess of what his CIA salary could explain. Moreover, many of the deposits occurred shortly after Ames had taken trips to locations where Soviet intelligence officers were known to operate. Weiser documented each deposit, cross-referencing it with Ames's travel records, work assignments, and the dates when specific CIA operations had been compromised. The correlation was striking. In May 1985, 1 month after Ames had walked into the Soviet embassy, he deposited $54,000 in cash. In September 1985, after a trip to Europe, he deposited $30,000. In 1986, after another trip, he deposited $65,000. The pattern continued year after year. Weiser prepared a detailed financial analysis report running to more than 80 pages that documented every significant transaction in Ames's financial history from 1985 forward. The report included charts, timelines, and comparative analyses showing that Ames's spending and deposits were completely inconsistent with his declared income and that his claimed explanation of family money from Colombia could not account for the amounts involved. The report was presented to the Night Mover investigation team in November 1992. The team's assessment was unanimous. Aldrich Ames had become the primary suspect. The decision was made to initiate full-scale surveillance of Ames. FBI special agents and CIA security officers began monitoring his daily activities on November 24, 1992. Teams followed him from his Arlington home to CIA headquarters each morning and home each evening, noting any stops, meetings, or unusual behavior. For several weeks, Ames's routine appeared conventional. He drove to work, spent the day in his office, drove home. On weekends, he and Rosario ran errands, went shopping, visited restaurants. There were no obvious meetings with Russian intelligence officers. Then, in late December 1992, the surveillance team observed Ames making a trip to a shopping mall in Tysons Corner, Virginia. He spent approximately 45 minutes moving between stores, appearing to pay attention to his surroundings in a way that suggested counter-surveillance awareness, pausing to look in shop windows, doubling back on his route, entering stores and exiting through different doors. After leaving the mall, Ames drove to a residential area in nearby McLean, Virginia. He parked on a quiet street, exited his vehicle, and walked to a mailbox on the corner. He placed a piece of chalk on top of the mailbox, then returned to his vehicle and drove away. The chalk mark was a classic espionage signal, a simple way for an asset to communicate with handlers without direct contact. The mark could indicate that Ames needed to meet, that he had information to pass, or that he was confirming receipt of instructions. Surveillance agents photographed the chalk mark and maintained watch on the mailbox. 2 days later, on December 29, 1992, the chalk mark was gone. Someone had removed it, though surveillance had not observed who. Throughout early 1993, the FBI obtained authorization to search Ames's home and office covertly while he was away. The searches revealed classified documents in Ames's home that he should not have removed from CIA headquarters. The FBI also installed software on Ames's office computer that would record every keystroke he typed. The keystroke logging revealed that Ames was composing messages that appeared to be communications to his Russian handlers, discussing operational matters, requesting meetings, and referencing payment arrangements. By September 1993, the investigation team had compiled sufficient evidence to make arrests, financial records showing unexplained deposits totaling more than $1.3 million, surveillance documentation of signal sites and counter-surveillance behavior, classified documents found in his home, and computer records showing him composing messages to Russian intelligence. The arrest was planned for early 1994. On the morning of February 21, 1994, at approximately 9:15 a.m., Aldrich Ames was driving his red Jaguar sedan north on the George Washington Parkway toward the CIA headquarters complex when FBI agents in multiple vehicles surrounded him and forced him to pull over. According to the arrest report, Ames appeared surprised but not entirely shocked. When told he was under arrest for espionage, he asked to speak to an attorney but did not deny the charges. At the same time, other FBI agents arrived at his Arlington home with a search warrant. Rosario Ames was at home and was detained. The search produced an enormous amount of evidence: classified CIA documents throughout the house, $20,000 in cash hidden in various locations, records of communications with Russian intelligence, notes about operations and sources, and evidence of payments from the Russian government. Rosario Ames was arrested and charged with conspiracy to commit espionage and tax fraud. Prosecutors believed that while she had not actively participated in the espionage itself, she had been aware of it, had benefited from it financially, and had helped Ames conceal his activities. Aldrich Ames was taken to the FBI's Washington field office and formally charged with espionage. As Ames's attorney reviewed the evidence, it became clear that the case was overwhelming. His attorney approached prosecutors with a proposal. Ames would plead guilty and cooperate fully in exchange for a sentence that would spare him the death penalty and for leniency for Rosario. Over a series of debriefing sessions beginning in March 1994, Aldrich Ames provided a detailed confession. According to his account, his decision to commit espionage had been motivated primarily by financial need. In 1985, facing debt from his divorce and wanting to maintain a lifestyle that would satisfy Rosario, he had rationalized that he could provide the Soviets with information, receive money to solve his problems, and then stop. The rationalization had been that the information would not really harm U.S. national security because the Cold War was becoming less confrontational. This rationalization had been both self-serving and completely wrong. The information Ames provided led directly to the arrests and executions of at least 10 individuals who had been providing intelligence to the CIA. Among them was Dmitry Polyakov, a Soviet military intelligence officer who had been providing information to the United States for nearly 20 years and who was considered one of the most valuable sources the CIA had ever recruited. Polyakov was arrested in 1986, tried and executed in 1988. Oleg Gordievsky, a KGB officer who had been working for British intelligence, was nearly arrested in Moscow in 1985, but managed to escape to the West in a daring exfiltration operation. He survived, but only narrowly. Sergei Motorin and Valery Martinov, 2 KGB officers stationed in Washington who had been providing information to the FBI, were recalled to Moscow in 1985, arrested, and executed. The full list of individuals compromised by Ames ran to more than 100 names. Some were sources who had been providing valuable intelligence. Others were CIA officers working undercover whose identities Ames revealed to the Russians. The damage assessment prepared by the CIA and FBI concluded that Ames had caused more damage to U.S. intelligence capabilities than any spy since the end of World War II. On April 28, 1994, Aldrich Ames appeared in U.S. District Court for the Eastern District of Virginia and pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit espionage and tax fraud. Under the plea agreement, prosecutors recommended a sentence of life imprisonment without possibility of parole in exchange for his cooperation and his agreement not to contest the forfeiture of all assets he had acquired through his espionage activities. Judge Claude Hilton accepted the plea and the recommended sentence. In his remarks from the bench, Judge Hilton noted the extraordinary damage Ames had caused to national security and the loss of life that had resulted from his betrayal. Aldrich Ames was sentenced to life in federal prison without possibility of parole. He was also ordered to forfeit all assets acquired through his espionage, including the Arlington house, the vehicles, and all bank accounts. Rosario Ames was tried separately. She pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit espionage and tax fraud. Prosecutors acknowledged that, while she had been aware of her husband's espionage and had benefited from it, she had not been an active participant in providing information to the Russians. She was sentenced to 5 years and 3 months in federal prison. The impact of the Ames case on the CIA was profound. The agency conducted an internal review to determine how Ames had been able to operate for so long without detection. The review identified critical failures. The financial review process had been inadequate, accepting Ames's explanations without thorough verification. Communication between different parts of the agency had been poor, with the Counterintelligence Division not effectively sharing information about compromised operations with the Security Office, and the institutional culture had become complacent. With long-serving officers like Ames trusted as part of the institutional furniture, rather than subjected to ongoing scrutiny. In response, the CIA implemented significant reforms. Financial disclosure reviews were strengthened and made more rigorous. Background checks and security reviews became more frequent and more thorough. Internal communication systems were improved. The agency created new mechanisms for tracking and investigating indicators of potential security breaches. For the individuals who died because of Aldrich Ames's betrayal, there were no second chances. Their families became secondary victims. They had not chosen to become involved in espionage, had not made decisions that exposed them to risk, but suffered nonetheless. Oleg Gordievsky, who survived, spent the rest of his life in the West, describing in later interviews the psychological toll of knowing that his identity had been compromised by a traitor, and the guilt he felt about colleagues who had not been as fortunate. The CIA officers who had recruited and handled the sources compromised by Ames also experienced trauma. Several officers who had worked with Polyakov, Motorin, or Martinov left the agency after the extent of Ames's betrayal became known. They described feeling betrayed by their own institution, which had failed to protect the sources they had recruited, and the moral burden of having asked individuals to risk their lives only to have those individuals betrayed and killed because of security failures within the CIA itself. After the Ames case became public in 1994, recruiting new sources became more difficult. Potential sources in Russia and in other countries could point to the case as evidence that the CIA could not protect its sources. The argument was straightforward. If a CIA officer could betray sources to the extent Ames had, how could anyone trust the agency to protect them? Rebuilding this trust required years of demonstrated improvement. Rosario Ames served her prison sentence at the Federal Correctional Institution in Dublin, California. After her release in 1999, she was deported to Colombia. She returned to her family in Bogotá and lived quietly, declining all requests for interviews. She died in 2013 at the age of 61. Aldrich Ames was incarcerated at the United States Penitentiary in Allenwood, Pennsylvania. According to Bureau of Prisons records, he adapted to prison life reasonably well, working in the prison library and maintaining correspondence with a small number of individuals outside the prison. In interviews conducted by journalists and researchers in the years after his conviction, Ames presented himself as someone who had made a terrible mistake. He acknowledged that his espionage had resulted in deaths and that this weighed on his conscience. However, he continued to rationalize his actions in ways that minimized his culpability, arguing that the individuals who had died were themselves spies who had chosen dangerous work and understood the risks, and that the CIA's security failures were as much to blame as his own actions. These rationalizations were self-serving and failed to account for the fact that the sources Ames compromised had been acting on behalf of a system they believed in, while Ames had betrayed his own country for money. The moral equivalence he attempted to draw did not withstand scrutiny. The Ames case also revealed that Russian intelligence operations against the United States had not diminished after the Cold War's end. When Ames was arrested in 1994, the Soviet Union had ceased to exist for more than 2 years. The KGB had been reorganized into successor agencies, including the SVR for foreign intelligence. Yet the Russians had continued to run Ames as an active asset, had continued to pay him and to receive intelligence from him. This realization led to a reassessment of U.S. counterintelligence priorities and the recognition that while the ideological conflict of the Cold War might have ended, the strategic competition between the United States and Russia continued. The Ames case demonstrated that unexplained wealth was one of the most reliable indicators of espionage. As a result, financial reviews of employees with security clearances were strengthened significantly. Background investigators were given more authority to question suspicious financial transactions. Employees were required to provide more detailed information about their assets, income sources, and spending. The case also led to improved coordination between the CIA and FBI in counterintelligence investigations through joint training, shared databases, and formal protocols for managing joint operations. Aldrich Ames remains in federal prison. As of this writing, he is 83 years old and has served 30 years of his life sentence. He will remain in prison for the rest of his life. According to prison records, his health has declined in recent years. The families of the victims have largely remained silent. Most have declined to speak publicly about the case, preferring to grieve privately. The few who have spoken have expressed anger, not just at Ames, but at the CIA for failing to protect their loved ones, and at a system that treated human beings as expendable assets in a global competition for intelligence. The question of accountability in the legal sense does not fully address the moral questions the case raises. The legal system can impose punishment, but it cannot restore what was lost or make whole what was broken. The families of the victims, the CIA officers who worked with the compromised sources, the colleagues who trusted Ames and felt betrayed, all of them have had to find ways to live with consequences they did not choose and could not control. Aldrich Ames was not a mastermind operating according to some brilliant plan. He was a mediocre CIA officer with financial problems who decided that betraying his country was an acceptable solution to those problems. He rationalized his decision. He enjoyed the money it brought him. And he continued to betray until he was caught. The damage he caused was enormous. Lives lost, operations destroyed, capabilities degraded for years. But the case also revealed systemic failures that enabled his espionage to continue for so long. The reforms implemented after the Ames case have made future penetrations more difficult, though not impossible. No system can be perfect when it relies on humans to implement it and when it must balance security with the operational flexibility needed to conduct intelligence work. The challenge is maintaining the vigilance that makes betrayal difficult while preserving the capacity for the work itself. For Aldrich Ames, now in his 9th decade of life and his 4th decade of imprisonment, the accounting is stark. He destroyed his career, his freedom, his marriage, and his reputation. He caused the deaths of people who had trusted the United States to protect them. He damaged his country's intelligence capabilities in ways that took years to repair. And what did he gain? Money that he ultimately forfeited, a few years of comfortable living before his arrest, and a lifetime in prison to reflect on the choices that brought him there. Aldrich Ames was 44 years old when he walked into the Soviet embassy on April 16, 1985. He was 52 when he was arrested. He was 83 when this account was written, having spent more than half his adult life in federal prison. And in between those moments, he lost everything, not through misfortune or circumstance, but through decisions he made for reasons that, in the end, proved utterly hollow.